time for this very timely webinar on issues of climate change, food security, COVID challenges in Africa. I'm going to be a moderator or facilitator for this webinar, which we are hoping will last for 1.5 hours. And we have a great panel lined up to basically take us through the various themes, the various guiding questions for this particular webinar. I'm Arnold Ambundo. I'm Kenyan. I'm based in Nairobi. I work for ACT Alliance. I'm sure most of you know ACT Alliance. We are just an umbrella of churches and faith-based organizations, mainly Protestant and Orthodox. I work on their climate justice program. And pretty much majority of colleagues here, like Iyad, are familiar, and we've engaged on a number of sessions. So we would like to begin because we want to really make use of our time here so that we can release colleagues to be able to also engage in other things as well. It's now 4:01, and I'm hoping other colleagues will join. We are now 30 of us, which is quite a good number, and thanks again for joining. So our webinar today, I'm pretty much sure all of us are now familiar with mute, chat function, and all those kind of things. So we wouldn't start again belaboring the key housekeeping rules. But I'd just like to outline the aim of the webinar. We're all aware that climate change is causing devastating impact in all parts of the world, especially in Africa, and especially through the impacts of severe droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events. These extremes or these extreme weather climate events are often associated with loss of life and property. We see increasing loss of biodiversity. We have cases of water scarcity. We have deforestation, soil and environmental degradation, migration of people and wildlife, and increased disease burden. There are actually evidences that the current COVID situation is related to, environmental issues we do. So for instance, and I'm sure we've all been reading a lot of things, and probably the purpose of this webinar is also to educate ourselves. For instance, I came across Iyad, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development Climate Prediction Center report for the larger Great Horn of Africa. And they're giving very grim statistics, and they're saying the Greater Horn of Africa is facing severe hunger and malnutrition, with a projected number of acute food insecurity for over 50 million people. That's really a big number. So today's webinar is going to focus on the link between COVID-19, the climate change, and food security in Africa. And of course, we also have colleagues who are not necessarily reside here or live here, but joined us from whatever parts of the corner of the world they are in, to just try and unpack this. What does it mean? Has COVID, we already know, has it impacted greatly on food security situation in Africa? Of course, we are guided by Pope Francis's vision of inclusive global economy, where it just calls, and I like it, it's a very simplified 9-page document that calls for building an economic system that protects the vulnerable and promotes sustainable prosperity. So in addition, the webinar will seek, of course, there are also other many guiding documents and strategies and visions that have been developed by not only people of faith, but also experts. The webinar will seek, in addition, to answer a couple of questions. One will be, what governance mechanisms or institutions do we need to respond to climate change in the African context? Are institutions working effectively to address these challenges, to coherently address the impacts of COVID as well as climate change and the inequalities that we're seeing in the world? Then secondly, we'll try to delve into how can Africa enhance its food security or basket and develop agriculture finance and the climate risk. What are the mechanisms? What are the processes? What are the stages, initiatives that can help Africa enhance its food security? Then lastly, how can African countries collaborate to meet Africa's food and energy needs entirely from a renewable source? We know we are always in this situation of we are energy poverty continent, in terms of we are calling for renewable energy, but at the same time we are cutting down the trees for firewood. So and how can we produce this in the most cost-effective way? We are glad that you are joined by Dr. Iyad from the UNEP Faith for Act initiative, who will give us a keynote address or speech for 10 minutes. Then we have also a panel lined up, very eminent people, knowledgeable, who are going to inspire us more with very creative ways and ideas of how we get out of this situation. We'll start with Dr. Nana Ama Lute. Then we also have Dr. Olu Ajayi. We also have Dr. Emmanuel Nyanzi and Dr. Luminesh. I'm feeling intimidated already. These are really scholarly people who I hope they will give us whatever required. So we are grateful that the organizers, we know Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network for Africa, of course, in collaboration with UNEP, we have Yale University Global Justice Program, we have the Academic Stand Against Poverty, and Act Alliance ourselves as moderators, and then the Jesuit. So I would just like to request that we begin with Dr. Nana, but before that, if you have any questions, I would like to request that we sort of hear from the panelists who have just been given 5 to 7 minutes. Once we hear from them, then we can open this up to questions and answer. But in the meantime, feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and we'll probably get in touch with you going forward. So Dr. Nana, please, you have the floor, and we are ready to hear from you. Thank you.
The keynote.
Thank you, Arnold.
Oh, sorry, Nana.
Okay, we have the opening first, right?
Yes, yeah, this smiling so hard. I don't know why.
My name.
Okay,
hold on. I wait. Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Arnold, and it's always a pleasure and honor to be with you. Well, now digitally, but I miss my friends in Kenya, and hopefully in the near future we will get back together and celebrate our efforts together. And I am very glad that this webinar is being organized just after the conclusion of the G20 Interfaith Forum, which has concluded on Saturday, in fact. And in preparing for the Interfaith Forum, we have held a number of consultations. One of them was the impact of environmental degradation and climate change on Africa. And I had the honor to present the keynote address for that conference and consultation as well. So I will be sharing with you some of the reflections, the facts and figures about the situation in Africa, and then propose some of the recommendations to move forward. So, I mean, it goes without saying that Africa is rich in natural resources, whether it is arable land, water, oil, natural gas, minerals, forests, wildlife, and the continent holds a huge proportion of the world's natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable. And Africa is home to some 30% of the world's mineral reserves. For example, 8% of the world's natural gas, 12% of the world's oil reserves, and it has 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of chromium and platinum. And the largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, platinum, and uranium in the world are in Africa. So Africa holds 65% of the world's arable land, 10% of internal renewable freshwater resources. In most African countries, natural capital accounts for between 30 to 50% of the total wealth. And over 70% of the people living in sub-Saharan Africa depend on forests and woodlands for their livelihoods. Land is an economic development asset as well as a socio-cultural resource for Africa. A significant share of these resources is, however, used unsustainably, while others are lost through illegal activities, meaning that the stream of benefits generated from these resources is being reduced over time. For instance, Africa loses an estimated $195 billion annually of its natural capital through illicit financial flows illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal trade in wildlife, unregulated fishing, environmental degradation, and loss, among other things. So some of the key environmental issues that Africa needs to address are the following. First, nobody undermines the land degradation issue. Africa land mass of 30 million square kilometers makes the region the second largest continent in the world after Asia. Maize making annual contribution to the economy of nearly 21 billion US dollars, and that was in 2013, and livestock bringing 65 billion US dollars. Land in Africa, most prized asset for food production, nutritional health, and economic development. Despite its importance, about 500,000 square kilometers of land in Africa is degraded every single year due to soil erosion, salinization, pollution, and deforestation. The key drivers of land degradation include urbanization, deforestation, and unsustainable farming practices. In addition, the region will have about 450 million people added to its population by 2050. The second issue is freshwater, marine, and coastal resources. So Africa expanding economies are resulting in greater demand for freshwater, but its quantity and quality are decreasing as a result of overexploitation, climate change, and pollution. While the growing population means that average internal renewable water resources will continue to dwindle, more than half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa still does not have any access to improved sanitation compared to 90% coverage in North Africa, with vast differences between urban and rural areas. Third, air quality. Indoor as well as outdoor air pollution poses a major problems for the continent, both for environment and for human health. About 90% of people in sub-Saharan Africa are exposed to indoor air pollution. The key drivers for poor air quality in Africa are urbanization, industrialization, and motorization. About 70% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa still rely on solid fuels for cooking, heating, and lighting. There's a notable underutilization of the continent's vast renewable energy resources, where only 10% of its hydropower potential is exploited. Poor air quality affects human health, with an estimated 600,000 deaths per year attributed to indoor air pollution in Africa. Fourth, illegal trade in wildlife. The illegal trade in wild flora and fauna is a global problem, but it poses serious economic and security risks for Africa. This is one of the largest sources of criminal earnings in the world, estimated to be worth up to 150 billion US dollars per year. Local demand for wildlife product is equally high, and the illegal local harvesting of biological resources may actually be higher than the global organized crime. Fifth, the issue of food security and climate change. No continent will be struck as severely by the impacts of climate change as Africa. Given its geographical position, the continent will particularly be vulnerable due to the considerable limited adaptive capacity and exacerbated by widespread poverty. Climate change in particular continue to affect economic growth and livelihoods of vulnerable populations. By 2020, 75 and 250 million people on the continent are projected to be exposed to increased water stress due to climate change. In the same year, that is 2020, in some countries, yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%. Global warming of 2 degrees would put over 50% of the continent's population at risk of undernourishment. Projections estimate that climate change will lead to an equivalent of 2% to 4% annual loss in GDP in the region, and that is by 2040. Assuming international efforts keep global warming below 2 degrees, the continent could face climate change adaptation costs of 50 billion per year by 2050. According to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the region, 70% of its inhabitants will directly rely on the land for their livelihoods. The amount of usable land is decreasing as the number of people who need it is increasing. Africa's population is estimated to grow to 4 billion by the end of the century, up from 1.2 billion today. With the need for food increasing fast, some farmers are exhausting their soils, preventing their replenishment. At the same time, the United Nations reports that large areas of arable land are drying up and desertification is spreading because of overuse and global warming. These trends are putting a serious strain on food security in the region. 4 factors come into play when evaluating food security: availability, access, utilization, and stability. The IPCC report states that there is a strong consensus that climate change will have a significantly negative impact on all these aspects of food security in Africa. There is a direct impact on crops and livestock from increased flooding, drought, shifts in timing and amount of rainfall, and high temperatures, and indirectly through increased soil erosion from more frequent storms or through increased pest and disease pressure on crops and livestock caused by warmer temperatures. Food insecurity leads to massive migration to find usable land and is sparking conflicts over territory, such as in Nigeria and Kenya. Food insecurity also leads to famine, as governments in Africa, developing countries, are often unable to cope with emergencies and disasters. More than 10 million people in Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan are on the verge of starvation. So, what can we do? Let's consider some of the overall recommendations for Africa. First, we need to invest in strategies to improve land productivity, enable access to markets, and ensure all developmental activities are climate resilient. Second, implement integrated water resources management strategies that focus on increased water efficiency and improve ocean surveillance to reduce illegal, unregulated, and uncoordinated fishing. Third, increase efforts to achieve widespread deployment of renewable energy, including off-grid energy infrastructure, and improve cooking stoves, household ventilation, and cooking systems to benefit outdoor and indoor air quality. Fourth, implement policies to halt illegal wildlife trade, poaching, land, marine, and ecosystem degradation. This needs to promote trans-frontier conservation, benefit sharing, and inclusive natural resources management. And 5, facilitate the creation of networks to promote ecosystem stewardship that improves livelihoods, boosts economic growth, and maintains environmental sustainability. Faith-based communities in Africa comprise the largest social organizations, representing a repository of opportunities to spread the cause for sustainability in the continent. Conservation leaders should reach out to religious communities to collaborate in implementing these recommendations, with a view to enhancing the capacity for value-based sustainability decisions that link nature and human well-being. Some of the current practices of connecting faith and conservation provides information on some of the faith groups doing conservation work and presents several case studies on faith-based conservation. The African Union should adopt a practical strategy to engaging faith actors in conservation and sustainable development issues as an important implementation arm for the SDGs and the 2063 African Agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iyad. I was just drafting. I think I have 2 pages of your statistics: 30%, 65%. This is really encouraging, and I'm hoping the rest of the participants who are able to join us are finding this very interesting. Looking at the resources that we have, looking at how we do degradation, looking at how we have the potential to overcome this, but also at the same time, looking at how bad our situation is as an African continent. And I like the recommendations, and especially on implementing policies and value-based, restoring our relationship with nature going forward. Thank you, Dr. Iyad. I hope you can still be with us because a lot of questions around governance, institutions coming through will be able to give us an update on where we are. So I'd like to quickly go to the main panelists who are also, I say, very rich, very well versed on these issues. I'd like to welcome Dr. Nana to, I'm sure now there's no any other keynote address I'm leaving out. Nana, please, if you're ready, please share your screen and welcome.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen? Arnold?
Yes, for sure, Nana. Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, so you'll have to allow me to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, you have to allow. So enable participant to share screen, please.
Dr. Father Charles, are you able to share from your end to allow?
Lena, please.
Yes, sure. Thanks.
Trying again. Not yet.
Hello, Dr. Charles, are you in contact with Lena?
Yeah, she's
Okay.
She could be there now, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Nana, I'll add you a minute for this delay. Don't worry.
You sure it's more than a minute, you know?
You can go ahead, Dana. By the time you finish the introduction, it will have been done.
Okay. All right, so I should say good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. My name is Dr. Nanama Brown Tuche. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Ghana Physics Department, and I'm a lead author for the IPCC. It's up here. Okay, so I'm sharing it right away. Okay.
Yes, Nana, now we can see the screen.
Okay, so I was just on I'm a lead author in the working group 1 of the IPCC. So, and then senior lecturer at the physics department, University of Ghana. So I'm based in Ghana. Want to present on climate change over West Africa and 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming and the implications we have for Africa. I have to mute this, yeah. Okay, so this work I did together with Wascal, where I'm a guest lecturer, and then also on their research team. Oh, okay. Now, the opening remarks told us a lot about, broadly, about the implications of climate change in Africa. And of course, this is by way of introduction. If we continue the same way we are behaving today, we expect that the global warming will go much higher. So on my screen, we see the red showing business as usual scenario up to 2030. We're going to have, go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius for Africa. And then the other scenarios will be lower. So that is when we decide to reduce or limit our usage of fossil fuel and behave green. I don't want to spend so much time on this because everybody seems to be aware. But what does it mean for West Africa? In the context of global warming, we know that West Africa is a hotspot. From our studies, climate change is hotspot. It's where increased hazard probability is high. And we have vulnerability and exposure. So when they meet, then we are talking about climate risk, which is high. Now, over West Africa, we expect to have unusual heat waves. We expect to have more droughts and more floods. We expect to have challenges for human and natural systems. I will not also dwell much on this because the general overview, we are aware about the implications of global warming on the African continent. So we are guided by the global climate goals. We have the SDGs 2030 with 17 interconnected goals. We seek to eradicate hunger, poverty, strengthen our well-being, and through decent economic growth. So whilst we try to live a better life, we also need to have a decent economic growth as well. And we are doing this through urgent actions we can take under the climate change issues, so urgent climate actions. We have the Sendai framework, 2015 to 2030, which has 7 targets and 4 priorities. So that's focused on disaster management. We have the new urban agenda with 3 guiding principles, which is also talking about resilient cities and human settlements. And then we have the Paris Agreement, which most countries are signatories to and have agreed that during COP21, UNFCCC meeting in 2015, have agreed for all nations who are signatories to hold the warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and as much as possible, limit it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this work focused on what happens to agriculture when the warming gets to 1.5 degrees Celsius limits, and also when the warming gets to 2 degrees Celsius limit, the implications for agriculture. The models used are from the CODEX simulation. The CODEX is a global experiment, and the CODEX models are also a downscaled regional climate models from another project called the CMAP. It's also a global project, but worked with global models, global climate models. So these are the global climate models used, and the reference periods are also shown, and then the future periods for 1.5. So I explain again. For each of these models, we compare which period is the temperature going to reach 1.5 and which period is the temperature going to reach 2 degrees Celsius. So for different models have different periods where we are going to reach 1.5 and when we are going to reach 2 degrees Celsius. So you can see that for some models, we have already reached 1.5 in Africa. So like the first one, the Ken ESM2 model, we reached 1.5 since 2006. And it's like this through to 2035. Another model, 2017, another one, 2007, 2011. Some models are showing that from next year, you're going to hit 1.5 and all that. So these are the models used for this work. This is a bigger work, but for this presentation, I'll focus on agriculture over West Africa and some parts of West Africa. For the robustness of data or climate information, we used large ensemble of climate model results and more than 25 CMAP models. So the CMAP is the global climate models from the global experiment. Then 10 models from the Codex experiment. So altogether, we did 20 experiments. 2 models were run under Wascal at a very high resolution for some detailed analysis. That we did 4 experiments. So from IPCC, we are made to understand that the precipitation is very uncertain. Globally, we have decreasing trends in precipitation. And over West Africa, we have very uncertain trends in precipitation. It's mostly rainfall over our region. But then we have recovery over the Sahel region. You can see the blue, it's recovery of rainfall over the Sahel region. This is from observation. But of course, we have experienced droughts, which in the past was in the 70s and the 80s. And when you do projections, even though we are having recoveries since the 80s, the mid 80s to today, recovery over the Sahel region, the influence of the droughts in the 70s and 80s are so strong that they still affect simulations into the future. You know how global models work. We use the past to focus or to predict the future. So for temperatures globally, or the impact on West Africa, we can see that when we allow the globe to warm by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we expect West Africa to warm specifically about 1.75 to 2 degrees Celsius. If it gets to 2 degrees Celsius globally, West Africa on the average or the mean will be warming 2.5 to 2.75 degrees Celsius, which is a lot of difference. Now, when we get to precipitation, we still have very uncertain future for both 1.5 and 2 degrees. Though we see some recovery, or we see some increases in precipitation, but some areas we don't really have much trend to conclude on. Now, if we get to agriculture, this study focused on the western part of West Africa, and then eastern part, and then also in the Guinea coast, Guinea Savannah. So this onset defined based on FAO definitions, cessation or withdrawal of rainfall, length of the growing season. So these are parameters considered. And then we considered cash crops, millet, maize, sorghum, and then rice in some specific areas of West Africa. So the green, we see that cash crops dominantly cultivated in this Guinea coast region. And then we have millets grown mostly in the Sahel areas, maize scattered all over West Africa, and then sorghum, where we see the red spots, is for sorghum cultivation. Robustness and statistical significance. So a lot of the models agree 95% to the results. And onset, so this is 1.5. So the yield of these crops under 1.5 and under 2 degrees Celsius is shown here. And the difference between the 1.5 and 2 is in the last panel. So we can see that even when we use different definitions of onsets, we're getting very similar results. Delayed onset of rain for all crop zones is what we can see. And then we have greater changes in the millet and sorghum areas. So onset of rainfall, we're going to have delay in this. So which means that if we want to depend on rainfall for our agriculture, we should note that there's going to be a delay in the onset of rainfall in these crop zones. So we have this strong consistency of the models, which makes it robust. Now the difference between the 1.5 and 2 degrees is about 15%. So which means that we can still save the crops if we don't go beyond 1.5. So we can manage our ways around when we stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, when we come to the raining season periods, we can also realize that there's shortening of rainfall. So all the negatives, all the blue you can see is negative. So shortening of rainfall in days. So we're going to have, which means that late onset and early cessation of rain. So it's obviously shortening the rainfall. And the difference between the two is about 20% between the 1.5 and then the 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, another study which focused on consecutive wet days, consecutive dry days, also shows that we don't have much difference between the consecutive days under 1.5 and consecutive days under 2 degrees Celsius. These have implications on agriculture. So these are climate parameters or variables that have implications on agriculture. Now, on the yield, so this is specific for the northern part of Ghana and Burkina Faso and the northern part of Benin. So as you can see, for maize, millet, sorghum, under 1.5 degrees warming and under 2 degrees warming. This is from a study by Fayard et al. 2018. We can clearly see that these warming have significant effect on crop yield. So yellow, of course, red is negative, so it's like negative crop yield, reduced crop yield, and green is, should I say, suitability or higher crop yield. So somewhere in between, from -10 to 0 is what we are seeing for maize, millet, sorghum, under 1.5 and under 2 degrees Celsius. I move also to, further on this I hope I still have time. So again, we have for, because I have another interesting one on over Ghana. So maybe I go there. Okay. So this is from a crop model. This result is from a crop model called DSAT model. So where we try to change the planting style, and then where we try to increase fertilizer or make normal fertilizer without fertilizer, and then we try different ways of planting to see how these crops yield, the yield will behave. So even when we increase fertilizer levels, we still have the yield going down. This is consistent with the study over Ghana. This is work done for the Ministry of Agriculture in Ghana under FAO projects or support. So this is for maize, run under RCP 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. So each role is per scenario. And this is done for different agroecological zones of Ghana. So you can see, you don't need to worry about the details, but just to look at the trend of the lines. You see from 1980 to 2080. And then we see that the yield at the very beginning, so let's say this is the observation up to 2010 or up to 2020, it's looking good. But beyond 2020, we can see that all of them are under 2.6 is going down. So under 2.6 scenario is when we take ambitiously decide that we are cutting fossil fuel. Under 4.5, we want to manage fossil fuel, not too high, not too low. But under 8.5, that is when we want to live our life as it is, business as usual scenario. Then we're going to have very low yield, much reduced yield of crops, as we can see from these trends. So this is for maize. So the same is done for rice. And we can see that rice under 2.6 is not going to be too different from the yield we have today or in the past. But when we don't cut down the use of fossil fuel today, and the RCP 4.5, we expect to have reduced rice yield. And again, when we get to 8.5, living our life normal or business as usual, we're going to have much reduced rice yield. We did a vulnerability maps to show which areas are suitable for rice production and which areas are not. I'm sorry that the pictures are not too clear, but the first column is under 2.6, second is under 4.5, and third is under 8.5. We can see the green shows suitability of these crops. So that this first row is for maize. So maize is going to be more suitable in the southern parts than in the northern parts in future. And then the second one, or the second row, is for rice and the different scenarios. Again, rice is going to struggle in most areas of Ghana, especially in the northern part of Ghana, rice is going to struggle. But somewhere in the middle of Ghana, there's that marginal suitability, but not, and a few spots are going to be suitable for rice production. This is to inform our policymakers on ways we have to manage our land resources and crop variety. Interestingly, millet and sorghum are, especially for millet, showing that whatever we do, whether we use fossil fuel or not, whether we apply fertilizer or not, the yield is going to be the same almost throughout till the end, towards the end of the century. And then sorghum will have some decrease in under 2.6 and 4.5, and of course 8.5 as well, but not as low or as reduced as we have rice and maize in future. So similarly, vulnerability map or hotspot map were done for millets and then sorghum. So the first one, the first row is for millet, and the second row is for sorghum. Then we can see clear suitability in the northern part, the west-north part, for under 2.6 and 4.5. And then when we get to 8.5, it's suitable in the eastern part. Sorghum also showing where it's suitable. It's mostly in the northwestern part, other than the other areas of the region. So this is to, help us decide in our adaptation actions where resources must go and how we should manage our land, when we should have new varieties, especially when we are going to have, or we are having a shortening of the rainy season. So the shortening of the rainy season doesn't mean the intensity is going down. The same amount probably, but in a very short time. So then it paves way for flooding in the farms and then all that. So one adaptation option is also to create dams so that these water may have their way, run off into the dams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nana, and sorry for the small hiccup when you started. A couple of very interesting aspects came out of your presentation. I like the synergies that you try to relate around climate change and other international global frameworks. You talked about the Sendai framework, you talked about the Paris Agreement, and of course, the SDG, all under Agenda 23. And for me, maybe the main interesting question would be, what's the coherence probably going forward among all these international frameworks in order to deliver resilient and a just society. Also, what came out is clearly we are not heading, we are not curbing emissions well enough. We are well projected to go over 1.5, 2 degrees. And what comes in my mind right now is how ambitious are our NDCs that our governments are submitting, supposed to submit by 2020 as per the Paris Agreement. I also see that we seem not to be recovering better, or we seem not to be building back better, because we seem to sort of still suffer from the impacts of previous droughts and floods. And of importance is how statistical significant the results of various models are. They all point out the same results, that we are really in a crisis situation. Thank you very much. I'll now welcome Dr. Olu Ajay to take us through as we listen in. Please feel free to note the questions. Yeah.
I have to stop my share screen. Okay, now it's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alon.
Thank you.
Yes,
can you see my screen? Yes, please. Yes. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet. Just try again. But it's starting to share. I will let you know. Yes, you are now okay. Thanks. You can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and as well as distinguished participants and panelists. My name is Olu Ajayi, and I'm co-authoring this paper with another Ajayi, who happens to be my wife, my better wife half, so it's a joint presentation. Before now, I used to be a senior scientist working in the CGIR in Zambia, in Malawi, and Kenya, and some part of Africa. Before I moved here in Europe, in Netherlands, where I lead the Agriculture and Climate Change program under the European Union and ACP Technical Center for Agriculture and Rural Development. And I'm also a designated contact point for the UNFCCC. So just briefly, we'll just talk about enhancing food security in Africa under climate risk and under the challenge of COVID-19. I will talk about a few of the challenges, but lay much emphasis on the solution. Good enough, the keynote speaker and Dr. Nana already gave some very good background on some of the issues on climate change. So let me talk about first the global context. Every year, the 3 RBAs, Rome-based agencies, that's FAO, IFAD, and the new laureate of the Nobel Prize Award, which is the World Food Program, they always come up to look at where are we in terms of the state of the food. Let me try and see if I can. They talk about the state of the food and nutrition security. Globally, the latest one for this year, for 2019, which is released this year just about a couple of months ago, shows that there are about 690 million people that are undernourished in the world. And that's about 1 out of every 10. And that under the business as usual, this figure may rise to about 840 million by 2030, just about 10 years from now. Another thing that they also mentioned that came out.
Dr. Olu, sorry for interruption. Can you sort of enlarge your screen or reactivate so that in PowerPoint for the rest of the day? Thank you.
Is it enlarged now? Can you see it now?
In PowerPoint mode, you need to reactivate there and then go to PowerPoint. Sorry about that.
So, okay. No. I wouldn't want to
reactivate first. It's showing reactivate your PowerPoint.
Okay.
The yellow bar thing, you need to reactivate it first.
The yellow one?
The yellow, you need to reactivate the yellow bar thing that is restricting you to put it in PowerPoint. Reactivate your product, deactivated, just to keep your PowerPoint without interruption. There's a yellow thing along your computer, just up below the, yes. No.
Here, this one?
No, it's reactivate, you just passed on it.
Where is this one?
Just below, or
this
slide.
One?
Probably it can go slideshow, but you need to reactivate first. Yes.
Okay, here, this one?
No, just below. Yes, the reactivate. Yeah, just click on reactivate.
Oh, reactivate. Okay.
Yes. Then you see if it can go.
Oh, okay. But it doesn't. No. Oh.
Just go to slideshow.
Slideshow?
Yeah, that's why I just put here the slideshow, but then I wouldn't know why the slideshow. Okay, this is slideshow. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I wouldn't know why it's.
Okay, Dr. Olu, just stop your screen share and then click on your presentation slide, and then you now share the screen again.
Okay.
Restart your screen share.
Yeah, okay. Let me just, this is the presentation. Yeah.
Just go ahead. I think it's a product license issue.
Okay, so is it better now?
No, just go ahead the way you were.
Can you see now my screen?
Yeah, just share again.
Can you give me the license to share, please? Share screen.
Just share your screen.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah, better.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we were saying is that I was looking at giving the presentation on the global context that 690 million people are undernourished as at end of 2019, which is expected to rise to 840 million under the business as usual. And that, but beyond just enough calories, there are also about 2 billion people in the world, according to the estimate, are suffering from what they call the hidden hunger. That is, they don't have access to regular, safe and nutritious food. Unfortunately, just like the keynote speaker mentioned earlier on, the verdict is that we are not on track as a world to achieve zero hunger by 2030. That means the chances of achieving SDG 2 is under risk. I should now move now. Oh, okay. Now, what it means that now looking at Africa, since we are focused on Africa, if you look at this information and unpack it for Africa, there is a disproportionate rate of hunger in Africa. In Africa, the figure shows that 19% of African people are actually suffering from undernourishment compared to just 9% of the world. So what it means that the rate of hunger is twice in Africa compared to the global average. And in terms of absolute number, 250 million people among these 690 people who are hungry, they live in Africa. And okay, I mentioned earlier on, so what Africa has been doing so far has been to import food. As at about less than 10 years ago, the amount of food import was 35 billion US dollars per year. And currently, UNCTAD estimated in 2020 or 2019 to be 60 billion per year. That's quite a lot. It's set to rise to about 110 billion by 2030 if nothing is done. So it means there's a call for action. This thing cannot continue. Looking at the challenges to this food is the context of climate change. What climate change has done is that traditionally, most of our farmers in Africa, smallholder farmers, have evolved different indigenous risk minimization management practices. So they're able to use different mechanisms to identify when to plant, what to plant, and they interpret the weather and take decisions. But it turns out that with climate change, the whole system has kind of been disrupted. And the implication is the result is that a lot of households are going into poverty. And Dr. Iyad mentioned that earlier in his keynote presentation. A lot of drought now has led to crop failures, and some farmers, when there's a lot of drought, they are forced to sell their crop at ridiculous prices. The impact of climate change also has a lot of equity issues. The reason is because most of the people who are negatively impacted about climate change, we're talking more specifically about women-headed households and the poorer segment of the rural households, they are the ones who have the least capacity to adapt. There's also another implication of climate change that there's an increment in the perception about the risk. A lot of banks and credit agencies now see agriculture as even much more to be a risk, a very risky ventures. And that what it means is that they are very reluctant to lend finance and give credit to farmers. And if they do at all, it will be at a very higher rate because of this extra. And this particular challenge of climate change and agriculture is much more pronounced in places like Southern African region or areas where you have just one rainfall distribution. You know, in Southern African region, for example, the rains begin around November, December, thereabout, and by April it's done. So within 5 months, everything has to be done. So there is no second chance. So if they miss it in one season, that's the end for the whole year. What it means that drought and weather extremes are becoming the new normal. So how do we address this? Now, I want to talk about the second challenge, which is the challenge of COVID. As we know, COVID started, well, in Africa, essentially early this year, but it has a lot of implication. There's the impact on agricultural production and food prices. As we know that most of the agricultural products are perishable, with COVID and lockdown, that means farmers cannot move their output, and a lot of them perish. A lot of farmers, a lot of milk has to be just thrown away. A lot of tomatoes, cassava were perishing. At the same time, many of the crops, many of these crops and operations are time bound. You have to do them at specific periods. If you don't harvest, for example, they are gone. So because of lockdown, most farm operations could not be completed at the right time. Second thing is the fact that a lot of Africa in diaspora have been sending money home, and many of these people have been assisting people, like people in the US, in the North, who send money home to help their parents or their relations to cope with this. But with COVID, this remittance has gone very, very down. If you look at the figure I presented here, you look at South Sudan, Lesotho, and Gambia, for example. Remittances from the diaspora accounts for between 15 to 34% of the GDP. So it's a huge amount of money. Well, huge in proportion of the GDP. So now with COVID and inability for them of the remittance that goes down has implication in terms of fiscal injection to the economy, as well as resources that can trickle down into agriculture. I'm just talking of the proportion. But in terms of absolute amount of remittances, the highest one in the whole of Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is Nigeria, that has about $23.5 billion dollars being that is injected, followed by Ghana as well as Kenya. Those are the big ones. Now, another impact of COVID is the fact that with lockdown and a lot of things have fallen. Tourism and resources and income from related services have gone down. In Gambia, for example, tourism and tourist sector accounts for 20% of the GDP, about 9% in Kenya, and about 30% of the GDP in Seychelles. Now, with COVID and all these restrictions and restriction on air and lockdown, all of these are impacted. So COVID has implication in terms of the amount of resources that has flown to Africa, that have flown to support food and nutrition security. So, well, like I said, we can talk about the problem until the cows come home, the challenge of climate change, challenge of COVID. So, what are the solutions? I will just give 4. The first one is we need to support the scaling up of proven climate smart agricultural practices. There are some approaches and practices that can help farmers to keep producing at high productivity under climatic change, that helps farmers to adapt to climate change, and also where possible, they can also help farmers to contribute to climate mitigation. So those ones exist. We have CSA, different combinations and approaches, but the question is, there's a big gap between the science of discovery of these things exist, but they're in the shelves with the scientists, they don't flow to the farmers. The people who need them most are the farmers. So these things are not still getting to the farmers. So we need to support their scaling up. Many times it's just talking of small pilots reaching out to 10,000 farmers, but then we need to talk of millions of farmers. But to do that requires resources. I put it here, a number of times, the effort has been focusing, based on my experience all around Africa, is on what I call the food relief effort. That is, when there's drought, when there's an emergency, we see the government calling for assistance to supply maize, to supply food. But I think we need to move to more proactive and focus on getting mechanisms and production practices that help farmers to produce to mitigate against climate change and adapt to climate change. So we need to move to that. But to do that, we have so many practices all around Africa. We have to admit that not all of them are equally performing well in all places. So sometimes farmers have been discouraged when there's a high promise, but at the end of it all, when they adopt it, they are not really performing up to that level. So what needs to be done, funding and resources to help identify the different climate smart agricultural practices where they have the best potential to perform in terms of biophysical and socioeconomic attributes. I'm glad that Dr. Nana mentioned earlier, tried this kind of hotspot. Where are the hotspots for the adoption? And of course, in doing this, I think one thing is very clear. While African farmers or agriculture can contribute to mitigating climate change, but this should not be the primary purpose. It should not be at the expense of food security in Africa. So that's the first thing. There are existing solutions. Let's take them out and to farmers who can need them. Second thing is, there is need to increase the finance and investment to support climate actions in agriculture. All of these things to scale up requires money. And I'm glad that the previous speakers talked about the nationally determined contribution target. I remember in the run-up to 2015, the Paris Agreement, there was this great excitement in terms of contributing towards the targets that are supposed to be achieved. Then with a lot of African governments went into UNFCCC, went to this with this idea that they went with 2 targets. The first target is what they call unconditional targets. They are saying we will use our own resources, our own national budgets, domestic resources to be able to get things done up to this target. But they're also saying we can also achieve this level, contribute this level of emission target on a conditional basis, provided there is an explicit external support of finance to support it. Then a lot of, I think about 100 billion was promised all over globally, but at the end of it all, the amount of resources that flows to Africa is very little. And I say the next thing we need to talk about is how do we ensure that people walk the talk of the promises on climate finance? Here I give a figure, just a kind of the global finance that is available for various regions. And as you can see here, yes, the amount of resources going into climate finance is increasing. As of 2018, it's about 500 billion, but actually currently it's gone to over 600 billion. But if you look at it, the one I circled, less than 5% of it, actually 3.5% goes into, of this flows into Africa. So can you see, so this needs to change. Also, how do we increase the amount of climate finance that goes into agriculture in Africa? So that's the second thing. Third thing I want to talk about is in responding to COVID, which is lockdowns, it means agric extension officers are not able to go to the field. Everybody's locked down. So what happens? How do we ensure that farmers are still able to get information about and access information about agricultural practices and so on and so forth? So what needs to be done, the third thing is, solution I'm proposing is that we need to harness the potentials to promote digital enabled agricultural extension systems. How do we ensure that all these various opportunities that are existing, emerging opportunities to promote digital ICT enabled agric extension are encouraged? We have to face the reality that the traditional face-to-face extension is still very important, but it's not able to meet with the number of farmers. In some cases, you find that one extension officer is expected to reach out to over 500, even sometimes 1,000 farmers. That is practically impossible. So how do we supplement this with digital extension? And currently, there are sort of successful pilots like farmer digital registration and electronic wallet in various countries. In Kenya has been done, and agric project which I'm involved in under the EU ACP project I mentioned earlier on in Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. They have been able to reach out to several, a couple of hundreds of thousands of farmers just digitally. A lot of farmers now have access to our phone. I was actually cracking joke with somebody recently. I said, sometimes even some of the phones that some of these farmers have is much more sophisticated than the phone I use. So how do we harness this? A lot of satellite now that can improve that. So that's a third strategy. Let's promote this digital enable extension so that with COVID or without COVID, farmers can still access information and can still sell their products and income. And the fourth one, which is final one, is there's a need to promote inclusive policymaking processes in the agric sector of Africa. If you look at agricultural policies in many of African countries, it's still sort of top-down. It is still government-driven. Of course, government make policies, but there's a need for an inclusive and multi-stakeholder policy engagement processes that should include producer organizations, the farmers organizations, non-state actors. These are private sector players who have investment, who have resources and money to invest into agriculture, but they need to understand what are the policies, what does it mean for their business, and how can they be engaged, how can they give feedback to the people who make policies. Government make policies, but there's need to kind of have a kind of 360 degree to have a feedback so that we can ensure that the policies are relevant and they can promote sustainable and profitable farming ventures. And also in terms of this, I think, again, in identify solutions when it comes to agricultural sector to climate change, I think we should look at farmers as a co-creator. They should be co-creating knowledge. Somebody on this panel, Dr. Nyazi and myself, we have worked on looking at different indigenous knowledge practices that farmers have evolved over the years that can help to kind of respond and adapt to climate change. How do we ensure that this knowledge is not lost? How do we ensure that some of this knowledge are factored in and brought and integrated into strategies to help address the challenges of climate change in Africa? So these are the 4 key things. And finally, I just want to end with the last slide. First message I have is this: food and nutrition security is a priority development agenda in Africa. And this top priority agenda is facing, more recently, the challenges of climate change and, of course, COVID. Second message is that these 2 challenges have diverse and multi-dimensional impacts that may worsen the existing inequalities in African society. And finally, is that it's a clarion call. We need to move from action. It's a call to action from various multiple players to how we can reverse this trend. It's been saying things are not done, but at least I think we need to move from just talking of the challenges, but looking at the solutions. How do we change the narrative from just talking about the problems and problems and problems that we've been talking about for the past decades? How do we go into solutions by implementing solutions? To do that requires concerted efforts, multiple players of everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Olu. A couple of many interesting points there, gender differentiated impacts of climate change, the indigenous knowledge, and the fact of climate finance being an enabling pillar towards our work, and the fact that we need to be inclusive in our interventions and leveraging on technology to be able to achieve resilient and food secure continent. Thank you very much. Now I welcome Emmanuel Nyazi, then we'll finish with Luminesh. I'm mindful of the time here because we need to sort of get into the Q&A later on, but you have the floor, Emmanuel. Thank you.
I guess my screen can be seen now.
Yes, it can be seen. You just need to make it more.
Yeah, sure. So what I think, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Brown Kulche and then Dr. Jai for their introduction and also for the issues they've talked about. And so it will make my work rather less burdensome because I seem to have touched on most of the essential issues concerning the modeling and the science of the climate and some practical issues we have to look at. But I'll try to move a bit quickly. But my presentation is taking quite a simple form. And I'm going to talk a bit about climate change in Africa, the impacts which have been mentioned already, and how do we respond, adding on to what Dr. Jaya said, and also reflecting forward food security issues in post-COVID-19 era. So it is really clear that most of the economies across Africa is actually experiencing some slight growth and some major growth. However, the most important issue is about that most of the world extreme poor also live in Africa. With a total population of about 1.2 billion, and about 50% of this number are mostly moderately to severely food insecure, and almost about 20% are severely food insecure. So the hunger is on the rise in the continent of Africa, no doubt about that. And if you want to look at the gender differentiation, you realize that women are even more impacted by this than men. However, climate change has actually exacerbated the situation. So in the face of climate change, the situation has become even more horrifying. But so when we talk about the climate change and how it relates to the impact on food security, I don't want to revisit what Dr. Kluchi has said, but in a more summarized manner, we're expecting to see some heat waves, which is to be increasing the warm days. We're expecting to see some droughts, which will be affecting production of food. We expect to see some intense and more frequent extreme rainfall, which is likely to destroy farmlands and also food production. And let's not forget about storms that will destroy infrastructure of rural community, and not only in rural communities, but even those in urban areas. On the issue of, I decided to put this cyclone there to just find out, these are more practical example where the cyclone that occurred, cyclone that died in the southeastern part of Africa that actually resulted in huge destruction, which is also a typical result of climate change because the sea surface temperature rises and the warm air rises into the air, which gathers a lot of rain. And as a result of the Coriolis effect, this water is released, this in terms of rain. And it's expected that Adai, for example, produce nearly about a year's rainfall in just a few days. So you have sea level rising, intense rain, and then more flood destroying the area. So these are some of the climate change issues that we are likely to experience, and even now we are still experiencing. So my next presentation will actually focus on food security. For a food system to be vulnerable, there is a need for us to look at these three components. Do we have food that is available? Do we have food that is accessible? And how are we using this food? Agriculture is an essential part of food security because it provides the food that we eat and also serve as a source of livelihood for many people in rural communities. However, the agriculture has been impacted. Can you imagine in about 2013, almost about 1.4 million US dollars was actually estimated to have resulted losses from flood drought in Africa, sub-Saharan continent Africa. And drought and flood are the main issues when it comes to food fluctuation on the continent and even extreme weather event that actually affect it. So having this in mind, let me look at what will be the issue of food availability under climate change. We're expecting that as a result of climate change, there will be reduced production of food crops and also livestock production and in some affected areas. And also local losses could have temporary effects on local market because there's no food available, then people are not able to also sell at the market. And not only that, now supplies are also likely to be affected because fertilizer input will also not going to be enough. So food available will also be less in terms of quantity and even in terms of quality. Not only the high cost for storing grain, perishable product, Dr. Ajayi mentioned how tomatoes are being destroyed, are getting, spoiled because of the issue of COVID, but also more because of extreme temperature. We expect those food, the availability of food like tomatoes and all those things can also be impacted. Now with food accessibility, it talks in terms of location, affordability, and preference. It's important that with climate change, most of the farmers who will be impacted are likely to have lost a lot of income, and even non-farm employment will also be a challenge. So if they can afford, if they don't have a lot of money, how can they really even access the food? And also you should bear in mind that the full cost of pricing for water in some areas, like South Africa, there's a lot of drought. So if there's water price actually increase, or we don't have access to water, definitely going to translate into the food production, food that we actually available in the market, and people can access it if it is very high in price. Around the last one, the local increase in food prices, as a result of also drought, because if you don't have a lot of food produced because of climate impact resulting from drought, then the prices are going to increase. Now, what about food utilization, the nutritional value of it, social and food safety? There's likelihood of risks of ill health from eating food that is spoiled, and also ability of the body to even process the food is reduced because of heat stress or diseases that are likely to happen. Dryness also increasing the risks of dehydration and all that. Also dietary adjustment with low nutritional content. So these are the three components that food security is going to suffer from as a result of climate change. Now, what can we do? There is a policy, regulations, and structuring that we need to do. There is also need for investment into infrastructure. Forestry, farming, and fishery need to have some adjustment, and also food processing. But I would like to touch on some salient points here. With policies and regulation, the most important one that is on the rise is as a result, is called the climate services. So with climate services, we are able to generate and harness climate data in a way that it becomes relevant to inform decision-making of farmers at the grassroots level. So we know that every day a farmer rises, he look at the weather to make his prediction. But the question that comes to his mind is whether the rain will be just as what happened the last year. So if you're able to predict this, then the farmer will be able to know that there will be more rain, less rain, or perhaps normal rain within the season. We also need to get crop weather-related insurance. I know there are some works being done on generating insurance for farmers as a result of looking at weather data. There is also risk management frameworks that need to be developed. We also need to support for risk settlement in areas that have been hit by extreme events. So with the farming and forestry, we need to check the variety of crops and species that plant flat and heat tolerant varieties of food. And then we also need to use land management practices that will enhance soil for food production. So there are other factors that we have to look at, but let me also talk about infrastructure. There needs to be new level of investment in infrastructure. We need to invest in irrigation in areas that don't have. Also, we need to invest in flood embankments to be able to protect communities and farms from flooding. And not only that, we also have to build wind-resistant technologies and support people in terms of high storms that can prevent their farms or crops from falling apart. Now, food processing, alternative source of fuel, electricity. We don't need to look at how do we harness solar and other forms of energy instead of using our normal the hydro, and then maybe nuclear source of electricity. Use of recycled wastewater. We need to try to enhance the wastewater in a way that we can reuse them again and not waste it. Okay, so instead of using sophisticated process of actually drying food, we also have to look at how do we alternatively create ways of processing food and packaging them. It is important that the food preparation practices must be looked at. For cooking, farmers cut down trees every now and then to try to prepare food. What is the alternative? Use of dry cooking methods. What do we have to look at when it comes to food preparation practice? This is some of the things that we have to really do. So looking forward in post-COVID-19, I think I would like to summarize with this, but it will depend on whether COVID-19 will result in a real change, structural change on the continent, or perhaps a just marginal adaptation to the issue, because people may either not take it seriously or it will have some drastic impact on the structures of the existing system. So we expect that in COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 era, access to key input will be very high. It will be difficult because product credit might become difficult. Like I said, if farmers don't have even support from remittances from Europe, like Dr. Jai mentioned, how do they even invest into their production? Competition between emergency medical supply and food, which one do we look at as a government? Because government shift a lot of attention to medical supplies, and then at the end of the day, food supply also be affected. Countries and companies may also go into diversification instead of comparative advantage. So if you're a country like Ghana, you think you export cocoa to Europe, or maybe you export coffee from Kenya, and Europeans want to diversify and go into coffee production or something, or perhaps because a time is coming where they will not get enough from the continent, then we should also look at how do we diversify in order to produce locally and then feed ourselves locally, so that we don't have to depend on other people in case COVID-19 becomes more accelerated and difficult. Consumption of food patterns may also change. People want to live healthy because of COVID-19. They don't want to eat a lot of oil food. They don't want to eat a lot of rice or something because of the health issues. So there will be changes. So you realize that already prices, if you go to the supermarket, people are not buying things like oil food products, sweet or something, or they want to buy healthy products, and compared to animal product, they want vegetables, fruit. So there will be changes in preferences. And more, last but not the least, is a potential increase in budget allocation for healthcare systems may also affect the attention given to improving resilience and food production systems. Governments would like to shift a lot of attention to healthcare because that is where the politics is, because people are dying or people are suffering from sicknesses that they want to deal with. And then they ignore the other food production systems, which would then create a cycle of problems on the continent. So with food security challenges in Africa, is going to be exacerbated by climate change. And in post-COVID-19 era, we have to be careful what we say because it will depend on whether there will be massive structural changes or just a marginal adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emmanuel, for your. I liked two key aspects came out last that you just mentioned, our adaptation of our food production and consumption behaviors, and the linkages between climate change impacts on the four spheres or four areas of food security. Thank you very much for that. We still encourage questions as much as possible. Some have come through, but now I would like to welcome our last panelist to give us his insights into this discussion. Dr. Lumnesh, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm talking to you from India, from the city of Bangalore. Very happy to be part of this. I would like to focus on the global governance, the changes that are necessary in the global governance in order for the world to address the current climate crisis. Already we have been listening to all our speakers, and they have spoken to us about the current climate crisis. I would like to start saying that the current climate crisis is not just an ecological crisis, but also a social one, which Pope Francis said in Laudato Si. I see that this current climate crisis as not just an ecological or social one, but also economical, political, scientific, cultural, and religious crisis of our times. And therefore, the current climate crisis knows no borders. Its effects are felt and would be extended to every being on this earth. So the question is, when the problem is so complicated and complex, the solution should also be sought in an integrated way. The solution to the current climate crisis, already we have heard many speakers coming up with concrete action plans and the strategies that must be adopted. The solution to this current climate crisis should be achieved effectively through global governance, where all of us have a right and a responsibility over the earth. The crisis brought about by the accelerated pace and the probably irreversible character of the effect of human activities on nature requires a collective answer from governments and citizens. Nature ignores political and social barriers, and global dimension of crisis cancels the effects of any action initiated unilaterally by state governments or sectoral institutions, however powerful they may be. Hence, it is not merely the governments that are called for a global governance, but all peoples, organizations, educational institutions, scientific community, and especially the poor and the nature-dependent communities like the farmers and the tribals. Many multilateral environment-related agreements have been forged in the past 30 years, but their implementation remains difficult. And we have seen that from 1992 with the UNFCCs and the COP conferences that we have every year, and we had the Kyoto Protocol, and finally we have arrived at Paris Agreement. But the implementation has always been very, very difficult. And therefore, that is a very important thing. Due to this transboundary nature of climate change, various calls have been made for a World Environment Organization. Some countries are in favor of it, while others are not. So when we speak about the changes that we have to bring about global governance, the question that many people ask is there a global governance to address climate crisis at the present scenario? Only if there is something, then we can change. Of course, we know that UNEP under the United Nations is an international body which is working for environmental issues. But critics would say that UNEP is a small-scale organization with a limited mandate. Even though the environment and climate change are framed as global issues, it is precisely at this level that government institutions are least effective and trust more delicate, says Levin. At present, a single worldwide governing body with the powers to develop and enforce environment policies does not exist. When we speak about the changes of global governance, it is not that we are to reflect merely on the strategies and approaches, but importantly on the convictions that arise from within to have these approaches. Therefore, I would like to share a few excerpts from the reflections of Pope Francis in the encyclicals Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, which he just signed on October 3rd, 2020, where he invites all people of goodwill to work unitedly to bring in the much needed change in this world. In the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he says, "We are brothers and sisters because we are children of one creator, all in the same boat. And hence we need to be aware that in a globalized and interconnected world, only together can we be saved." Pope emphasizes that in an unhealthy society that turns its back on suffering and that is illiterate in caring for the frail and vulnerable, we are all called, just like the Good Samaritan, to become neighbors to one another, overcoming prejudices, personal interests, historic and cultural barriers. We all, in fact, are co-responsible in creating a society that is able to include, integrate, and lift up those who have fallen or are suffering. He again affirms that since rights have no borders, no one can remain excluded, regardless of where they are born. In this perspective, he also calls us to consider an ethics of international relations. It is a politics centered on human dignity and not subjected to finance, because the marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem. The havoc wreaked by financial speculation has demonstrated this. Hence, popular movements have taken on particular relevance as true social poets with that torrent of moral energy. They must be engaged in social, political, and economic participation, subject, however, to greater coordination. In this way, Pope states that it will be possible to go beyond a policy with and of the poor. Another hope present in the encyclical regards the reform of the United Nations. In the face of the predominance of the economic dimension, which nullifies the power of the individual state, in fact, the task of the UN will be to give substance to the concept of family of nations, working for the common good, the eradication of indigence and protection of human rights. The International Institute of Sustainable Development proposed a reform agenda for global environmental governance. The main argument is that there seems to exist an unspoken but powerful consensus on the essential objectives of a system of global environmental governance. These goals would require top quality leadership, a strong environmental policy based on knowledge, effective cohesion and coordination, good management of the institutions constituting the environmental governance system, and spreading environmental concerns and actions to other areas of international policy and action. The immediate tasks that need to be done. In relation to the Paris Rule Book, timeframes must be agreed upon for the submission of national climate plans. Greater pledges and reassurances that developed countries can mobilize funding commitments are needed. A clearer role of the UNFCCC's Paris Committee on Capacity Building is needed to help countries turn commitments into reality. Engaging with national human rights institutions in different countries that highlight community reporting, as in the case of climate change, to strengthen the development of recommendations and legal processes addressing climate. Some of the social mechanisms for a peaceful, trustworthy, and a political policy framework for action are working with advocacy groups and networks to broaden and deepen the message of climate emergency, creating media and social platforms for giving voice to indigenous concerns and broader participation, providing grant programs for community action like the dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous peoples and local communities with Conservation International, engaging faith communities in their local actions to care for our common home, linking academic studies to social process of our times, supporting learning programs focused on engagement and skills development, seeking social participation in highlighting local pilot experiences and events. And therefore, when we speak about this global governance, the understanding should be that we all join hands together from all organizations, governmental, non-governmental, scientific, educational, all communities come together and work. As I said earlier, there is no clear-cut framework as of now. And therefore, we are in the process of evolving one which should be more implementable, and as well as that which allows all of us to share ideas and work for the greater good. Thank you.
Yes, Father Minesh, are you done? We lost you at some point.
Yes, I am done. I'm done. Were you able to hear me?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. I like your excerpts from the Laudato Si, and I like the fact that you reminded us that climate crisis is just not an environmental, ecological issue. It's actually a development issue that touches on many, many, many aspects of human security, as it's been well elaborated in many reports and discussions. So that marks the end of our expert panelists on the subject or the theme of the day, trying to look at the links between COVID, climate change, and food security. And you can all agree with me that the panelists and the keynote address speaker have done justice to this. It almost felt like I think we should pay you. It almost felt like we were in a climate change food security class with a lot of statistics, with a lot of modelings. Thank you so much. And from a civil society perspective, we keep saying we can't push for advocacy, we can't push for certain policies to be in place if we are not informed. And science and what you guys have given us really gives us that impetus and that energy, you know, to back our advocacy and our climate strikes. So there are a couple of questions that have come through here, and I would like to just go through them. One is addressed to Dr. Nana, and it's all the way from Philippines. Just very briefly, what would be your take? And this is from Philippines. Hi, I'm Adam from Philippines. My question is Dr. Nana. Is there a similar focused or study using the same models presented for the forestry and fisheries sector, either in some other areas in Africa or Asia? So the question is there other similar focus studies or models that are presented basically on forests and fisheries in Africa? Then, because most of the panelists have already sort of in their presentation already alluded to what they see is the possible recommendations, policy recommendations going forward. I'll just like to also just point out one that has come through is in most discussions, the issue of emissions are not usually given priority in Africa, mitigation. Yet lots of investments are going to mitigation. So how do we balance mitigation adaptation efforts of climate change in Africa, considering emissions are not really an issue for us as a continent? How do you balance that? Because we already see a lot of investments are going to mitigation, solar panels, and little is going to adaptation, which many experts and studies have said Africa needs more of adaptation and support towards that. How do we balance the need for energy and environmental conservation when majority of rural African populations still depend on charcoal as a source of energy? I would like a lot of discussions have come around that, so we could start with that. And probably I could give Dr. Iyad a chance. Then any of the other panelists can jump in on that has come. But we would like Dr. Nana to firstly respond to Adam's question on other systems or modeling that have been used in fisheries and forest sector in Africa.
Okay, Arnold, and thanks, Adam, for the question. I think we have, so these global and regional climate models, we don't have for, specific impact areas, but we have climate impact models, like the one I mentioned, the DSAT is for crops. And so the input is the climate data or climate variables into these models. We have also like GLEM. GLEM is a FAO model for livestock. I've not come across impact model for fisheries, not yet. And for forestry, there are so many different ways forest issues are projected, but that is not in my field anyway. But then if I have an assignment to do, I go all out to find a way to do. And then there are statistical models. For example, I'd worked with GLIM before, but I'm not able to, it's not flexible. So I'm not able to assess the different climate scenarios, the RCPs, in checking the impact of these scenarios on, let's say, the yield of livestock, the production of livestock. So I had to resort to a purely statistical model, which is called ARIMA in R. So there are ways. So that model, ARIMA, takes dependable variables. So it will take rainfall, it will take temperature. It will take any variable you give it. It's open. It's a multi-variant regression model. So there could be such for fisheries and probably the forestry areas. You may have to explore, and then if you want us to discuss further, you can have my contact, and then we discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nana. On the question of balancing energy demand versus environmental conservation, and then the one on adaptation. And one has just come in as well, where I see, which will be tied to that one of adaptation, is what concrete steps can farmers and governments, should take to reduce greenhouse gas emission? That's been asked by Mary. So what steps? So tying to this discussion on adaptation and mitigation, the balance of the two.
The question is to me, right?
No, the question, this is to Dr. Iyad and any of the panelists. Emmanuel can jump in, Dr. Lu can jump in, but it's just the panelists on how do you balance mitigation adaptation. The focus seems to be on mitigations than adaptation, yet we know our emissions levels are not that high, but you also mentioned something on 1.5. So the question here is, how can farmers and governments take measures to reduce emissions, and how do we balance that?
Yeah, I get it. So the point I want to make here before other panelists will come in is this. Of course, we're not giving a lot of emissions, but what is the measure of a lot or not a lot? In terms of climate change, you can't underestimate even a little emission, whichever way you quantify it. You can call it small, but you cannot underestimate that small emission that we're talking about. Maybe it's like having a water which is already full, a cup full. It's just one drop which will make it overflow. And when it overflows, it's not only that drop you put it overflows and a lot more water drops. So the climate system is so sensitive and so fragile that as much as possible, we all must put in efforts to control or reduce emissions. I think I'll put it that way. But of course, we have to be serious as African countries or developing countries in general on our adaptation options. We have to be more stringent on our adaptation options. And of course, as much as possible, deal with the mitigation aspect as well. Allow other panelists to come in. Thank you.
Very quick comments, either Emmanuel or Dr. Olu, Iyad, if you're on standby as well.
Thank you. Just a quick addition to what I could just mention is this balance in terms of, again, there's still some various practices that we can call multi-output practices. That means they give different types of output from the same type of kind of input we invest in. And I want to cite a practical example of agroforestry. Agroforestry is a system where you integrate trees into cropland, where with that you improve the soil fertility, improve the soil structure, that eventually also leads to higher level of crop yield. So you improve the productivity through improved soil fertility. And at the same time, you can sequester carbon. It's called carbon sequestration, a method of kind of storing carbon into the soil. And in addition to that, you get fuel wood, because some of these things are trees and shrubs. So you get both the fuel wood, you get improved soil fertility, you also have carbon sequestration. So these are some of the things that can be improved, that can be taken out, that can be scaled out to be able to get the advantage of this type of practices. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it has been well elaborated, but it is important that, and of course, it has been said that combining both adaptation and mitigation is the ultimate and the best strategy for combating climate change. But what it is that it's also been estimated that even when we don't add additional emissions into the atmosphere, there is also a high tendency that the change we expected to see will definitely occur. All right, so whilst we are thinking about mitigating, if we try to stop and change all our innovations and technology in a way that there will not be no emission now, zero, still the impact of the previous emissions are going to affect us as it goes. So the adaptation arena has been classified into whether we want to be reactive or we want to be anticipatory. And at all costs, the reason why people have laid more emphasis on adaptation now is because the impact will definitely occur. And so it is important that whilst we think about mitigation, we also think about how we'll react or how we'll try to anticipate the coming event. So there should be a balance that will make it an effective climate strategy. But at the same time, there is need for us to prepare for the coming catastrophe with the current emissions that are already been done. Yeah. And there was a question also about the farmers, but I didn't get that one clearly.
What concrete measures can farmers take to reduce emissions?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Ajayi has mentioned quite a number of those points. You know, so most often when studies are focusing on farmers, they focus on climate change adaptation. What are they doing as adaptation? But in most instances, these farmers' activities also result in some mitigation practices. And so if for example, a farmer decides to develop a practice that conserves soil moisture or the conserve soil itself, if the soil is in a good state, there will not be emission of carbon. But if a farmer decides to go through a particular practice like using maybe bullock or tractors to degrade the land in a way that is not really recommended, you realize that the soil loses structure and there's a tendency of a carbon emissions also. So there are farmers already doing a lot of things. And what it is important is that we have to reiterate them and also look at some of these practices, whether they are good or not, to fight climate change as we say it.
Thank you. There's a question for both Iyad and Luminesh. I hope they are on call. And the question goes like this. We have roughly a year until COP26. In what specific areas can faith-based institutions engage with UNEP and with the scientific institutions in increasing urgency in national contributions and commitments, NDCs? So for the Luminesh and Iyad, so we are roughly a few months to COP. So the question is, what specific areas can the faith-based institutions engage in with UNEP? I think in preparations or in calling for, increased ambition in the NDCs that are being developed currently. So what are these areas that the faith-based institutions can engage, both with the UNEP for governance, as well as scientific institutions for, science and facts about the climate crisis? Please, if you're on board, any of you can have a shot.
Yes, this is Iyad. So this is an excellent question and very pertinent. As we know, unfortunately, COP26 has been postponed until 2021, which means postponing further action and commitments by governments. However, it gives us some time to really engage better and plan for our engagement in leading up to COP26. I have been working with the Cabinet's Office of the UK government for the engagement of faith-based organizations in COP26. The initial idea was that we need to organize an interfaith forum at COP26. We bring in faith leaders and they present their concerns and what have you. But certainly this wouldn't help us. It's not that we need a platform to speak at. What we need is a real engagement. So this is what we agreed leading up, starting, or we have already started until November 2021 in a series of engagements with faith-based organizations, not to keep saying governments need to be accountable and we need to increase our ambition, but also show the commitments of faith-based organizations. As you know, faith-based organizations are also investment organizations. They invest billions of dollars around the world in gas and oil and other industries. So we need to show leadership leading to COP26. We need to arrive at COP26 and say, listen to the government leaders and world leaders. We have committed to do our part. And this is where we are coming. For example, just a couple of months ago, 42 organizations, faith organizations, mainly Christian organizations, and one in North America for Muslims, imams of North America, have committed to divest from oil and gas. So already there are commitments, but we need to put that into practice. It is not only to say we are not divesting, but also to say, where are we investing in? And to show them that employing renewable energy sources or water harvesting or whatever environmental actions that can be made, that needs to be shown that we are divesting from an oil and gas, but also we are investing in positive, or what we call impact investment, to show the practical solutions at the ground. In addition, we've just concluded a global conference, which is called the Faith for Nature Multi-Faith Action, where we issued a declaration, or not we, but the 460 faith leaders who participated in the conference issued a declaration called Our Sacred Commitment, which is a very strong call by the highest level faith leaders. We had, representatives of the Pope, representatives of Imam al-Azhar, the Buddhists, and so on, committing that this is climate change is our existential threat. And we need all, as in the Fratelli Tutti declaration, we all are in this together, and we need to activate our commitments, verbal commitments, into actionable items where we do something on the ground that is feasible, but also that is impactful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iyad. There's a question here in the box by Thomas. It's a very long one, but I think it talks about a FAO definition, and the question is, I think it ignores some of the aspects of food absorption, issues to do with energy. And I think the question is, does any of the panelists have a sense of how much more common undernutrition really in your that your country is measuring than what FAO is measuring? That's on food security. So I don't know if any would like to have a shot at that. That's the chat box. So it's just about FAO food definition on that someone has a challenge with it. And I think the key question is there more that countries are measuring than what FAO is measuring? But thanks for that question on the COP. The other one is around food issues, around sustainable food production. And someone is really not happy here. Looking at the figures that we have been given, how much is spent on food imports every year in Africa? What are we doing as Africans that is not allowing us to be self-sustainable in food production? So a key question on how come we are not producing enough, or we are just always in food insecure situations. Any take?
Yeah,
Okay,
maybe I just.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
All right, so I think the issue, I'll start from, there are so many questions, so it's quite somehow, but Africa's, I will touch on first on Africa's importation of food. Of course, because it has been estimated by the African Development Bank that almost about $35 billion US, which has been the annual food import by Africa. And this number has been estimated to increase, to about 3 times as that by 2025. So you can imagine how much we are importing onto the continent. But then the question is, what is then the problem? So the problem, as we have it, contributing to these high amounts, is we have a lot of arable lands in the continent. So what is the reason why we are not injecting into it? Is it that governments are not seeing the value of food production, therefore are not putting money into that, or government is doing enough? Because what is the percentage of budget that is going to agriculture? So if you look at the percentage of government funding or budget that is going to agriculture, that is the output we are having now. So if we want to look at government injecting more money, not only government, but even the private sector had to also go a step further. And we have to see farming and agriculture as a business. So if we do that, then we'll be able to know how much we are accounting for in terms of food production. But as I stand here, I think the problems are enormous, but the solution is simple. How much of our money is going into agriculture production, and whether we are seeing agriculture or food production even as a business or not. For me, I think the answer is we don't see it as a business that much on the continent, because if we do, we'll be able to make a lot of outputs here.
Dr. Olu, just in 2 seconds.
Yes, just same thing. Some years in 2013, African head of states agreed and they met in Maputo, and they had this Maputo declaration that they took up the engagement that at least 10% of the national budget will be spent or be devoted to agriculture. But 10 years in 2014, when they did the review, less than a quarter of African countries, African government actually invested in up to that minimum level into agriculture. And so we are talking of some even invested less than 5%. So it shows the extent of which we take agriculture. That's one. And then secondly, also, we found out in one of the studies we did that apart from just investing in agriculture, the amount, not everything is spent into agriculture. They might have budgeted that they are spending this 5% or 10%, but at the end of the day, at the end of the year, less than that is actually invested to implement work in agriculture. So just like Dr. Nyazi said earlier on, I think these are issues. And again, some countries, they focus on the minerals. I won't want to mention some countries because they have found oil, they thought now we have found the solution. And so agriculture is just by the way. So these are issues. Thanks.
Okay, colleagues, we are way past our time. I would like